All right, everyone can hear me. Hopefully just let me know in the chat if you can't. Yeah, so I'm Zoe. Welcome to my webinar. Sorry, I'm just getting this closed. There we go. Welcome. So this is my webinar on invasive-free gardening. I'll just let you all know that we are recording this so that people can watch it again later. But yeah, welcome. Some people might show up as we go, but I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So EKISC operates on the Ktunaxa and Shuaptek people's land, and this is really meaningful for us because we are helping to we are so deeply tied with the land when we're managing these plants, and we want to build really strong connections and acknowledge the history and whose land this really is. So that's really important for us. And so the topics we're going to cover in this webinar, so I'm going to introduce myself and EKISC and all the things that we do. I'm going to kind of introduce what goals and constraints we might have for our gardens that we can address and kind of work towards. And so the first thing is I'll give some tips on getting invasive plants out, and then getting some native plants in and established in your garden, and then a few other considerations. And at the end, I'll send out some resources for you to use. So as an introduction, East Kootenay Invasive Species Council, we're dedicated to mitigating the impacts of invasive plants and animals and everything that is just a non-native introduced species that is affecting our economy, our society, and our environment. And so invasive species are the second leading cause of biodiversity worldwide, which is a really crazy thing. Like, you maybe don't think of it when you think of environmental damage, but it's actually a really huge issue that is impacting us. And so you may or may not know much about invasives already, and you might not know much about gardening already, but hopefully we can all kind of learn something about invasives, because this is what I'm here to talk about, basically. And so EKISC, we have two teams, and one is the field crew and one is the outreach and education crew. So our field crew, they really are just our boots on the ground. They are going and surveying and doing weed pulls and monitoring lakes and stuff like that. And then I'm on the education crew, so I talk to people at markets. I host this webinar. We go to kids groups and teach kids about things. So yeah, hopefully you'll see us around otherwise. And so my name is Zoe. I've introduced myself already, and so I'm a summer assistant here. I started in May, and since then I have learned so much. I learned something every day on this job. And I'm interested in gardening just because I've always kind of been around my mom's garden, and we've always kind of struggled with invasive species in our garden, and it's really just come to my attention, especially with this job. So I'm sure that you all could probably teach me something as well, because I'm still learning every day with this. And getting back into our kind of topic that we're all here for, is thinking about what kind of garden our goal is, what do we want? And so I'm talking about getting it to be invasive free, but invasive free just means the absence of invasive plants. So I'm going to also give tips on how your native plants can thrive. And so, yeah, sorry. We want a well-adapted garden that's going to thrive within our whole seasons, especially with these really hot summers that we're getting. And another goal we might have is if you're growing food, you might want to get lots of fruit or vegetables, and that's a really fun goal to have. And a few others are having it drought resistant and pollinator friendly, because a lot of our invasive species are actually not very friendly to pollinators, even though they produce nectar, they maybe also introduce diseases. So we want our native plants in for our pollinators. And if you have any more goals or anything to add, you can put it in the chat and I can try to address that as well. I'll open that. All right, so there's no questions in the chat so far. And feel free as I'm talking to add any questions so that I can kind of address it as I go. But then we'll start. So some barriers in achieving this kind of ideal garden is invasive removal, because sometimes it's not as easy as just pulling a weed out, because they can grow back and they can be really hardy plants. And another struggle that a lot of people have, I think, is buying new plants when they are not sure if they're even going to survive. So it can kind of feel overwhelming. Especially these plants are sometimes expensive, you want to make sure that they're going to thrive in your yard. And not knowing what to and what not to buy can be overwhelming as well, because garden centers don't always have labels on them telling you what's invasive and what's native, and they sell invasives a lot of the time. And that ties in with there's a lot of misinformation and lack of awareness. So for example, sometimes you'll go to a garden center, and this isn't really pointing fingers at them, because it really is just a lack of like education and awareness, but they might give you a wildflower bag like this, and just looking at the cover here, I can see two invasives. So this is bachelor button and oxeye daisy, and so this is kind of misbranded. These flowers are wild somewhere, but not here. And so like you'll see the bees on these, but they're actually not wildflowers. They're not good for like the environment here. So yeah, and we're trying to get more information in these garden centers too, but you do have to learn to navigate it yourself a little bit, because it's still in process. So our first kind of step with getting invasives out of your garden is being able to identify them. So the first thing is, without even knowing what plant it is, you might be able to know if it's invasive. Some things to look out for: if it's a really aggressive grower, if maybe it's been sold to you as something that grows like a weed, maybe it is a weed, and not just benign, maybe it is really taking over. If it grows in disturbed and gravelly areas like this mullein here, maybe you didn't even buy it, maybe it just shows up, that can be kind of a red flag. And a lot of these invasives flower and seed like a lot of times in the year, and that can be a sign that it's like reproducing and outcompeting your native plants. So maybe once you've seen some red flags in a plant, maybe you're worried about one of the ones in your garden. At EKISC, we have 3 ID books. We have our BC ID book, and so this shows like every plant that is mandated in BC to be controlled in your yard. So it's just got kind of like the basic, the ones that you really need to be aware of. We've got the same one for Alberta. And we also have our kind of the continent, which is really nice. It kind of is like with the whole region that goes kind of down into the States, this like mountainous area. We also often use this app. It's called Seek. So if you have an iPhone, it's super easy to use. You take a picture of the plant and it can identify it for you. So that's really useful. And then you can kind of go further from there, seeing what that impact of that plant is. There we go. And so once you identify your plant, you kind of maybe you don't know what to do with it. So Google can be overwhelming and have a lot of information. We suggest going to either like EKISC or ISC BC is Invasive Species Council of BC, and they have really good like trustworthy information. So for example, knotweed would be a pretty crazy find in your yard, but say you found knotweed. I would Google ISCBC knotweed fact sheet, and it could take me to here. And so you can read all about how it's introduced, where it is. But if you go down a little bit, let's see. It has this whole page here about pest management. So there's like, it'll tell you how to control it mechanically. And some plants, for example, have really like long roots and they grow horizontally. So for example, maybe if you try to pull it, it'll stimulate growth. And so this will tell you for each specific plant what the most effective control is actually going to be. And so once you've looked into it a bit, just wait for that, there we go. Once you've looked into it a bit, you can treat it accordingly. Obviously this isn't always like a walk in the park. You have to kind of get on your knees, start digging. Some people are more comfortable with herbicide if you know how to use it and you want to. That's something that's totally an option. Even mowing can be a form of control. It helps it not spread. I know that some people have suggested if you get like 1 or 2 weeds pop up to pour boiling water on them. If you really want something that's like, if you want something super natural, no chemicals, that's just boiling water. And the other important thing is to reseed afterwards, because those invasive plants have really likely left like seeds or fragments in your soil, and they're going to keep growing back unless you have something to compete with them. So that ties into how you're going to put native plants in. And so the first thing you want to do when considering putting native plants in is kind of assessing what your garden is like. And so especially if you live in like maybe the Kimberley Cranbrook area, you know it's quite dry. So for example, what I would do is go see the nature park and find some kind of dry areas and see what plants are growing there and maybe compare it to my garden, see what would thrive. However, you don't want to take plants from those natural spaces because that's really disruptive to like an ecosystem if you're tearing plants out. But it might give you a good idea of what might thrive. So you can maybe ID what your soil is. If it's really rocky, gravelly, moist, whatever it is, you can kind of match it to plants. And I'll show you more about that later. And for example, if you have a south-facing garden, you might get a ton of sun. And so those are all kind of things you want to take into consideration. Oops. And then once you you feel confident in what your yard is like, what the conditions are, you can research what plants will thrive in them. So for example, yarrow thrives really well in my yard because it doesn't get a lot of water and it gets a lot of sun. But we have this map on the internet that I found that is really quite useful for finding some plants that are good, like will thrive in each zone. So for example, if I'm looking for Kimberley, I will click on this zone. And it may or may not load, we'll see. But it can show you different plants that it shows you like shrubs and trees and flowers and stuff that will thrive in different conditions. So it will tell you what moisture level it needs, what sun and shade it needs, and what soil type. And so that can give you a really good idea of what you're looking for. And so if you do happen to go into one of your garden centers, you may or may not get like the information from them about like native or invasive species, so you kind of need to learn to navigate it yourself. And so a good rule of thumb for me is to avoid all kind of wildflower mixes because that's how a lot of invasives actually got here in the first place. Again, they're wild, but they're not wild here. And so a lot of these invasives even like you might know their common name, but you may not know their Latin name. So those can be hiding in there without you even knowing. You might know bachelor's button and not want it, but maybe you don't know what Centaurea cyanus is. And so unless you want to read through it all and make sure that they don't contain any kind of hidden invasives, we have, there's a lot of like invasive-free certified plants and like seed packs. So for example, EKISC has one if you want that to get you started. And there's also lots of others that I will show you. And so you can also, there's like, here, one sec. There we go. Sorry, it's taking a minute for me to load. If you go into a garden center and you find like a plant that you really love, you love the vibe, flowers, like something like that. An example is this butterfly bush. You might really like it, but it's invasive. So you want to find something like of a similar vibe that isn't going to be invasive. We have this resource, it's called Grow Me Instead. And we have like lots of like pamphlets and flyers about this, but this whole database is also online. So for example, if I was really liking the idea of butterfly bush, it would give me this whole list of things that have the same kind of vibe, same kind of flower to grow instead. So for example, this California lilac, this one may or may not actually be native, but at the least it's not going to invade. And it can tell you the moisture requirements, this kind of features of the plant. So that can be super useful. And I'll have this linked at the end just so that you can access it. And more about the sourcing plants. Just a couple suggestions. There's a lot in the East Kootenays. Basically, you can just go to Google and find something near you. But there's like the locally indigenous owned Nupqu Native Plant Nursery. And they have a really cool website you can check out. You can get in contact with them. We source a lot of our seed at EKISC from Interior Seed and Fertilizer, and that's in Cranbrook. And they have a lot of like grass seed mixes, like really big bulk mixes if you have a lot of property. And yeah, so there's a lot more. There's what is it? The Kootenay Native Plant Society, Teepee Mountain Native Plants. There's a lot of like different ways to source these plants. So yeah, and so a few more tips is that even if you want to keep like all invasives out of your garden, not all your plants have to be native. So some non-native plants are actually just okay. It's up to your, it's your choice how much you really want it to be native plants, but a lot of your flowers, your tomatoes, things like that, they're not invasive. Another tip is to plant for different seasons. So a lot of invasive flowers come up a lot, like over and over again. So if you're planting native plants, you want something that's going to simulate. If you want flowers like for a longer season, for example, a prairie crocus, you might want some flowers in the fall and in the spring. And yeah, so like things that are kind of going to look good even if it's not flowering are also a good consideration. So shrubs and trees are really nice. And some other considerations. I talked to some like fire volunteers not long ago, and they were interested in kind of collaborating with Firesmart Landscaping. So that's something that maybe you want to consider for your lawn, is something that like buying Firesmart plants. If you want to, like if you're really into kind of restarting a garden, we have like watering restrictions here in the summer a lot. So you might want to get an irrigation system that's not going to like drain the water into like something else. For example, we live on like a bit of a slope and the water just drains off the soil. And if you live in Kimberley, Cranbrook, you know that the deer they eat a lot of things that even they're not supposed to eat. So if you don't have a fence, there's like a lot of deer resistant kind of plants that they usually don't eat. So for example, bleeding hearts, we have a lot in our yard and they don't eat them, which is really nice because they're pretty. And yeah, the final thing too is that especially with these hot summers we're having, you might want to consider how much shade you want. So obviously a tree does take a long time to grow, but maybe planting it now if you want to have shade later on is really going to be a nice idea. And so these are some of the resources that I mentioned. What I can do is paste these in the chat, and if you're interested in getting an email later, you can just say that in the chat and we can email them out to you. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for content, but I have a lot of time for questions if anybody wants to say things.